Suddenly, Aslan came bounding into it. That is how C.S. Lewis described the plot twist in his creative process for the story that became The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I don't know where the lion came from or why he came, but once he was there, he pulled the whole story together. And in turn, this story has pulled together the imaginations of millions across the world. Now, 75 years after the first Chronicles of Narnia book was published, let's explore how The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe changed fantasy forever.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Christmas is coming. Step into the magical Lorehaven studio for Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, whose mission is to explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm me, Stephen Burnett. I publish Lorehaven.com. I'm also the author of a sci-fi novel about missionaries in space called Above the Circle of Earth that launched earlier this year from Enclave Publishing.
And I'm Zackary Russell, coming to you live from my spare room, and this is episode 289. 75 years ago, how did C.S. Lewis's fairy stories change fantasy forever? And we're going to be focused today on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Zach, I actually am in a wardrobe. Technically, I have a wardrobe studio. It's a rather large space, much larger than the wardrobe, at least as you've seen it in the BBC TV or film versions for the story. And literally, I can look back and I can see all of my coats lining the wall. So come to think of it, I've been in a very Narnian space after all this whole time.
Yes, I am in a room with a lot of books. As I often say, it's my study here at our house. And one of the things that will make this room complete is when I get a bookshelf door, like one of those Murphy doors, the hidden bookshelf or hidden door bookshelves. Unfortunately, we just learned that we've got to do some repairs and things on our house. So that's going to take that away in our budget. Not that we were really planning on doing that anytime soon. Those things are really heavy and involve quite a bit of changes you got to make. Like, I don't think I can have carpet in here anymore with one of those doors because they're quite heavy. So they have to have like that little wheel or something on the ground. Anyway, it is my goal one day to get one of those, but today is not that day.
I think you almost certainly have to have a load-bearing wall and reinforced door frame or something like that. But Lewis's story founded the foundations, really, of what we would now call modern fantastical fiction, not just for children, but for readers of all ages. And I think in last week's episode for the setup for today, I actually said that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published 70 years ago. Not true. I dropped a 5 there. It was 75 years ago. And even now, we're a month late because we were in the middle of Monster Month, and it was published in October of 1950. The first book, and yes, it is the first, not just published, but I think it is the book you should read first, in the famous Chronicles of Narnia series. And I'm pretty sure that was the first book that I read in the series. My set has what I will contend is the correct order. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, not The Magician's Nephew. And I would have read it first. I actually got this paperback set with some unusual illustrations, by the way. Narnia has been through a lot of different covers over the years. I think it was Christmas of 1993. And I don't remember reading them correctly at all, though, Zach. I'm pretty sure that I started reading each book just to see how it would go because I never read a series like this. And after all, that first book, as I've mentioned in other episodes, did have the word witch in the title. And, well, as a good Christian kid, witch is, I don't know if I'm supposed to read this book really, but, and it's not really from mom and dad anyway. I kind of really couldn't really get a read on what they felt about it. It was from Santa Claus. It wasn't from grandma. It was from Santa. And, You're pretty sure that Santa and your parents are on the same page, but can you really be sure? So I think there was a bit of a haze of suspicion over the book set until I got into them really and truly, and then became absolutely enchanted. And unfortunately, I don't even remember when that was. It had to have been fairly soon after the gifting. But what about you? Like, when did you first read specifically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or any of the other Narnia books that followed?
I always think back to middle school when I really got into fantasy, starting with Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, then Dragonlance, and then shortly after that in high school, The Wheel of Time. I don't remember from then on reading Narnia, but I know I read it. It would have been in elementary school, maybe as early as second grade or third grade, but that's the part I can't really remember.
Maybe like the peak age to read it. I read it a little bit when I was a little bit older, but I think that's the best age to read it then.
But when I reread Magician's Nephew, as an adult, like in my, whatever it was, late 30s, early 40s, and I got to the part about Charn and Jadis learning the deplorable word that wiped everything out, it was like this instant flashback. I'm like, oh, I remember reading this when I was really young, but how young was I?
Oh, wow.
6 years old, 8 years old, I don't remember. But if I had read Magician's Nephew, I'm sure I read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. I mean, of course, if I did it in the right order, as everyone says. So I think I must have been, maybe first or second grade when I read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Intriguing. So you at the time, though, had a wealth of fantasy stories around. As I can recall, for me, it was only the Chronicles of Narnia at that time. I mean, being homeschooled, you, of course, would go to libraries, but that wasn't naturally the section to which I was drawn, if they even had those sections in the libraries that I visited. Because it came at Christmas, gift from Santa, there was a special blessing upon this series. So maybe that's why it made such an impression on me, as it has for many, many, many of our listeners. I'll wager 95% or more of listeners to this episode. Or maybe it's because, they're just legitimately classics for a reason. Lewis packed so many wonderful truths and imaginations into this series, but it did start with that first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, published in October 1950. Without that book in particular, we would not be here with the Lorehaven mission, and I'll wager a lot of Christian-made fantastical stories would not exist, including other genres like space opera, which, by the way, we have a review at Lorehaven. I publicized it last week in lieu of a new review of Kathy Tyer's classic space opera, Firebird. Now, this story has an interesting history. It was originally published in the 80s, and it's also been through a few covers and even publishers. And now we've got an interlude trilogy, book one, coming out in March from Enclave Publishing. Also my publisher, by the way. So I guess Kathy Tyers is a colleague now, which is really cool because she's been at this a while, and Firebird is a classic also for a reason. But you can get to our review in the link in the show notes here, or just go to Lorehaven and search for Firebird. By the way, you'll also find it Lorehaven just published yesterday, if the Lord wills, before release date to this episode, a new article by Josiah DeGraff called "The Sun Eater Series is the Modern Sci-Fi Epic Christians Have Been Awaiting." Now, that should raise your expectations a bit. And when you read Josiah's words about this 6-book, about to be 7-book series, actually, I believe the final book releases today, if I read right. I think you'll also be intrigued by this series. It turns out to have some fascinating, deeply foundational biblical views of anthropology in there. That is the Bible view of human beings. In this galactic space opera fantasy, it's now 7 books, and I guess the series is complete now. Anyway, subscribe free, by the way, to get updates and join the Lorehaven Guild, where we undergo book quests every month into the best Christian-made fantastical stories that we find. All that is at lorehaven.com. Got a news story as well to tell you about from our top sponsor, Enclave Publishing. This is called Sons of Day and Night, which is the Chronicles of Twinsbane, Book 1, releasing now. Not even death can tell them apart. In the wild and lush kingdom of Twinsbane, everyone has a look-alike, and each twin is cursed to die when their double breathe their last. When an ancient plague arises, the kingdom's only hope is to sever these deadly ties. Yet King Dakios refuses to relinquish the cure, a legendary potion called the Separator. To save their kingdom, both Waru and Dakios must face their greatest enemy, each other. Enclave Escape presents Sons of Day and Night, the Chronicles of Twinsbane, Book 1, by Mariposa Orestio. Available now wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for Sons of Day and Night at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon or enclavepublishingstore.com. It's also available as an audiobook from Oasis Audio. By the way, it's got a fantastic cover by a friend of ours. You can find also quotes and notes about this episode that we will reference at the show notes for episode 289. That includes my review of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, although it definitely doesn't need my review, and an article just kind of reviewing all the Chronicles of Narnia series. And then, of course, we've done a lot of podcast episodes about the Chronicles of Narnia, including a two-parter about the top 7 myths about the series. And then that classic C.S. Lewis quote about pure moonshine that we'll reference here. So if you're a creator of these stories and you want to know a little bit more about why and how Lewis created Narnia, go to that episode and get more of that exploration. We'll also put the quotes that we reference in the show notes too. Chapter 1, though, The Lion. Now, the story wouldn't be there if, as Lewis said, Aslan had not bounded in. And I really thought it's important to stop there by talking about the King of Beasts, the son of the Emperor beyond the sea, who is very like Jesus, so much that if we use our imaginations and immerse ourselves into the story world and ask what if, I would like to get this out there right up front. Aslan is not just an allegory of Jesus. He's not just a type of Jesus. In the story world, by its own imaginary rules, Aslan is Jesus, okay? And that's something I think a lot of readers, by the way, it takes some time to figure out, especially for grown-ups, whereas kids maybe see it immediately. They're not thinking, oh, it's an allegory, or oh, it's even Lewis's word, a supposal. They just resonate with Aslan so much that, as Lewis himself later said in letters to children or letters to their parents, at least one parent, by the way, your son isn't just falling in love with a fictional character. Like the way that I intended is, no, he is actually enjoying a picture of Jesus in the fiction. And so when kids hear about Aslan, they have deep, heartfelt responses to him, just like the Pevensies do in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Mr. Beaver says Aslan is on the move, and then 3 out of 4 children have a very positive response that just gives us an idea of the impression that the very name has on people. And then a 4th child, of course, has a very negative response and ends up having to go through a redemption arc very famously. By the way, that's why this is book 1, because the narrator in that chapter specifically says none of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But if you read the publicate or the chronological order set, you already know who Aslan is. This is no surprise. And it's so important that Aslan be a surprise to us. We love this hero, this great lion, because he is not tame, but he is good. So many people have resonated with that extremely biblical idea that God is, in a sense, wild. He's unpredictable, but he is good. He does not defy his own nature. He's not arbitrary. Aslan in a later book says, I follow my own rules. He abides by them. And then even in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you see Aslan being obedient to the emperor's magic. Like, in a sense, Aslan answers to a higher authority whom we never see. And that's how it should be, because Aslan is incarnate as a beast for a world that is largely filled with mythological creatures and talking beasts. And then there's just the fairy tale idea that, well, who's the king of beasts? Like, even Mr. Beaver says it's obviously a lion. Like, everybody knows that. And if you know that, then it probably is because you have read the right books. And now The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe is definitely one of the right books. And not just because, famously in this story, Aslan directly repeats the death and resurrection of Christ. This doesn't happen in the other books. Probably if you read The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe and stop there and don't read Lewis's other quotes, it's understandable you'd get the idea that it's an allegory because, I mean, Aslan does the thing, but I will note he literally does a literal death and resurrection. And in another famous essay, Lewis, I mean, he affirms this. Obviously, Aslan is meant to be Jesus, but Lewis specifically says that, well, this isn't allegory specifically. And this is what he says in a 1956 essay. Some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children, then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology and decided what age group I'd write for. drew up a list of basic Christian truths, and hammered out allegories, he puts that in quotes, to embody them. This is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way at all. Everything began with images. A fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. At first, there wasn't even anything Christian about them. That element pushed itself in of its own accord. Zach, I've sometimes heard people say, well, the Christianity in stories will just happen by accident. You don't have to worry about it. It'll just happen. Or it doesn't even matter if it's Christian or not. What matters is it's a good story. Lewis disagrees with that. He isn't saying that he starts out like some sort of ministry pragmatist to get these messages through to the kids. He says, no, it starts with the images. And then I found the form, which is a fairy tale. And then it became Christian. Like, yes, that element is there. They are absolutely Christian stories. But he didn't try to do it. And no, he did not hammer an allegory into everything, which kind of belies the understanding that I think some Christian fans have, and even some beginning Christian writers, that, okay, I love fantasy and I love Jesus. Jesus first. So the fantasy has to be about Jesus. And because I've read Pilgrim's Progress and because I've read The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, that means I got to put in the allegory. I would just strongly encourage, hey, listen to Lewis here. He specifically says this is not what I did. But notice Lewis doesn't say there's no meaning to it. He doesn't say it doesn't matter if it's Christian or not. He says, yes, it is Christian. But that's why it's important to note that Aslan is not an allegory for Jesus. In this world, Aslan is Jesus. It's almost like a multiverse. Like, okay, what if Jesus didn't just create this universe, but all the universes? And then he went hopping into each one of them. And in some cases, dying again and then resurrecting again in different forms. Now, this is not theologically correct. Our Jesus Christ is incarnate forever. He is the God-man. He doesn't shapeshift into lions. All right. Technically, it's bad theology, but that's the beauty of fantasy. You don't need allegory to prop it up. And Lewis specifically disclaimed that. Well, there's more quotes in the show notes about that, by the way.
Yeah, it's obviously not just speculative world, but it's a speculative theology. Because as you said, it's imagining, what if Jesus wasn't trapped, confined, however you want to say it? What if he wasn't fixed in a human body forever, but he was able to incarnate as an animal and as a talking animal, and the lion, no less. And I think it makes sense that that's why Lewis started with this idea of a fawn carrying an umbrella, because he was imagining a world where, what if animals talked? And what if you had all these mythical animals that were intelligent? And okay, now what if there was sin and darkness and evil in this world? How would it be redeemed? Well, the same way that humanity was redeemed, by Jesus incarnating into that world as one of them, as the king of animals. We were watching Voyage of the Dawn Treader recently with our kids. It was our 9-year-old son's first time to see it.
The BBC version, yes?
Yeah.
Correct?
No, the one that no one likes.
Why would you do this to them?
Yeah, just so they could see the same actors and the trilogy, the Disney or Walden, whatever trilogy.
I will hold my peace.
But there was this moment in the film, Stephen, where it's when they first arrive on the ship, and Eustace is, very hot and bothered about everything. Is like, why am I here? What's going on?
Yeah, they did do that very well. I love Eustace in that movie.
Yep. And then the Minotaur speaks to him and makes him pass out. And I thought back to Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Minotaur was one of the bad guys, and I'm not even sure that it spoke in the movie or the book. You might correct me, listener, if I'm wrong here. So not only did Aslan redeem the Minotaur from darkness to light, but if I'm correct, he redeemed it from a dumb beast to a talking beast. And I think that's really the heart of Narnia, is that there's all these animals that start out on the witch's side. I mean, she's got the ogres, right? And I remember in the movie, there's like the leopards, running right before the battle starts. There's the wolves. And then later on, we see a lot of these same animals that are charging in the witch's army. They're on Prince Caspian's side in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and even in Prince Caspian, the movie or the story. So I think that's really the heart of it, that it's like this is a human story. Like, it's very much about the Pevensies, but it's like, what if humans got to see what Jesus was doing on another planet? And what if they got to sort of be participants in that redemption story.
Right. And I think maybe that whole idea now has unfortunately become part of the stained glass trappings that now are much more common to Christians, but it's because of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the other Chronicles of Narnia. Back when Lewis wrote this, no one had done that before. You had Sunday school lessons on one hand, and you had fantasy kind of out there, and people thought it was escapist and it was just fairy tales and kind of the medieval trappings with those. And Lewis was really the first one to famously combine them and then also connect with some of the stories that he had told as a child, a land called Boxen with talking animals. And apparently someone's going to try to force that into a TV show. And I don't know how that would even work anyway, but you put the name C.S. Lewis on it and it's gold. But here Lewis was actually doing something very different, even for him. He was the guy who talked on the radio about Christian apologetics and made it popular while still having the credibility of a scholar and a teacher of medieval and Renaissance languages and such. And yet he made Christianity easier to access for people. And he was a comforting voice during wartime. He wrote these longer scholarly works. He'd written the Ransom trilogy or the Space trilogy. We'll talk about that in the next episode, at least the third volume. And this was kind of a turn for him after he'd written all this nonfiction stuff, which, I mean, he'd already done The Great Divorce and Screwtape Letters, sure. So he was pretty skilled at fiction for grown-ups with that kind of satirical side of it. But this was definitely a turn for him. And yet now, for many people, it's the thing for which he is most famous. And part of that is because of Aslan and how Christ-like he is, because in the world, he's literally Jesus. And there are some differences, though, of course. Like, Zach, you mentioned that the movies kind of implying that like some of these traditionally bad creatures would have a redemption arc off screen. I don't remember how much those are in the books, but there are creatures who, like some who are on the witch's side or some who have a tendency toward evil, like certain kinds of dwarves, who are later found, like, well, this is kind of up to the individual level. Like there's some irredeemably evil creatures for sure. Hags, for example, and werewolves are no good. They don't serve on Aslan's army, and the Narnians don't want them in Prince Caspian. They're bigots. They're out on the far faction. You don't want to have them on your podcast. But there are creatures who can kind of go one way or the other. But with Edmund in particular, that's where the differences arise, because if you were to try to force what happens with Aslan dying and resurrecting there, it's much closer to only one aspect of the atonement, which is Christus Victor. It's almost like Aslan is dying to appease the White Witch, who is the Emperor's hangman, who's like somehow enforcing the moral law of the world. Well, that's not quite how it works over here. Satan has no role in the atonement other than presumably being happy that Jesus died and then getting quite the shock of his evil little life. But with Edmund, too, it's just one individual for whom Aslan is dying. Now, he does save all Narnia from a fate, but it's really only Edmund who directly benefits from Aslan's sacrifice. And then by the end of the story, you're not even sure yet that Edmund knows, but all he sees are the results. And so there's a unique power in that, is that the characters are not stopping to explain everything or apply it to their world. They're not talking about the mechanics of this particular view of atonement. And they're not going out and telling all the Narnians, hey, Aslan died for your sins, repent and join his kingdom. And then kind of winking from that side of the page, like, and what about you, faithful reader? The faithful reader, even as a child, can get it. They've seen an illustration of something that is like Christ's death and resurrection, and it is enough. The purpose of the story is not to get you saved, but it certainly is not going to hurt, and it almost certainly is going to help someone find or at least understand the real life redemption of our real life lion.
By the way, I just got a fact check. The Minotaur that's good in Voyage of the Dawn Treader is only in the movie. That is not in the books, apparently.
Nope. Yeah.
And the better example might be some of the dwarves, or at least dwarves as a species, or wolves. And I don't think that they were implying in the movie that Minotaur was one of the ones from even the witch. It's just
Oh, no. Well, that was generations later, for one thing. I
Right.
think what they were implying was we got a cool practical Minotaur suit, and we want to use that again in all three movies. They are awesome Minotaurs,
Production
by the way.
value, yes.
Yeah, that's not a CGI Minotaur most of the time. That's just great puppetry. But it clearly made an impression. We love the creatures of Narnia, but Aslan is certainly the top one. Or as the weird movie line says, the top geezer, which is not at all a very Lewis thing to say, by the way. Lewis inspires a lot of people, though, including our next sponsor, author Vince Mancuso, who has a new release that is suitable for young readers. He says, looking for a fantasy your young reader won't want to put down, and you'll actually feel good about them reading. In a fae tale, magical creatures have revealed themselves and claimed the world as their own. Floating cities hang in the skies, fae lords govern the earth, and one law binds mankind: no human may wield magic. When 12-year-old Isla Cosgrave's outlawed power awakens, she's thrust into a conflict that spans fae queens, dwarves, and human outcasts, each with secrets of their own. Isla may be the key to uncovering the truth and shaping the future of both worlds. A fae tale that is spelled Faie by Vince Mancuso is available now on Amazon. And it's got a fantastic whimsical cover, by the way. You can get more info in our show notes for this episode 289. And all the sponsors, as always, are at lorehaven.com/podcast, right on top of the page. Chapter 2, The Witch. We all love to hate her, and that is the point of the story. Zach, I think somehow the White Witch has become nearly as famous as Aslan. When you look around, it's actually kind of surprising how this little children's story has created these characters that are now so common in the popular culture, even among folks who have never read the book or even seen the movie. Of course, there's the Snow Queen inspiration. I think that's pretty clear. Lewis knew his fairy stories, so he would have tied that in with that original. The two are kind of linked up in the mythology now, one older and one quite a bit newer, 75 years old, actually. Just 75? Wow. I just paused a moment. Lion, Witch, and Robe was only 75 years ago. You could have great grandfathers right now who are older than this story. That's incredible. By the way, the White Witch has a strange mythological origin in the book. It's nowhere near the movies, because it's a little too weird for the movies. It's almost a little too weird for this. Mr. Beaver says, no, the queen is not of Adam's race. She's not a son or she's not a daughter of Eve by any means. She actually is descended from Adam's first wife, Lilith. And Mr. Beaver just says this like it's historical fact. And as if the readers, by the way, have any idea what the dickens is he talking about. All that aside, yeah, there's some weird ancient tradition of like, well, Adam had a first wife and, she was bad. So then we got Eve and like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. That's a little too pagan for me, even Lewis. But Lewis later on retcons it. Jadis is from a completely different dimension, as you mentioned earlier, Zach, called Charn. Spoiler alert, which I think is better, by the way, learned later in the series when the Magician's Nephew is book 6. That's where she comes from. She's descended from a long line of royalty, and she doesn't have a whole lot of motivation. She's just evil. I mean, you don't get her backstory in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She almost seems like a shallow villain. You don't really need it, though. She's the iconic evil Ice Queen, an overt inversion of the nurturing mother figure. She pretends to be nurturing and kind and compassionate with Edmund, and then that facade is rather quickly exposed later on. And that works, though, for this story. And maybe that's something that we lose in our emphasis on tragic villains and backstories and stuff. Lewis said that as part of the creative process for this story, that he had the bubbling of images, and then you had to put the images into a form because otherwise there'd be no story. And he said, well, I chose the fairy tale. Not only have I liked it since I was a kid, and I still like it now as a grown-up, but it works for the images and the kind of story that are developing here. And he said in part that the fairy tale is beautiful, partly due to its brevity. It's short, it's sweet, it's simple. And that means that all kinds of readers, not just children, can access it. And there's a power to that. All you need to know here is that the White Witch is a Satan-level threat who corrupts the seasons. She is disrupted with her evil magic, the natural order. You're supposed to get summer, fall, winter, spring, in that order, even in Narnia. And she makes it always winter for 100 years, always winter and never Christmas. Think of that. By the way, yeah, interesting hodgepodge that Christmas somehow is celebrated in Narnia, but readers of The Magician's Nephew can guess how that tradition came to be. So Lewis does subtly close the loop there for all you continuity wonks out there. Lewis also, by the way, is a medievalist. I think that actually has unlocked more layers to the story, not just with the White Witch and her particular kind of evil sorceress template there. But even going back to the idea of Aslan is the king of the wood, the king of the land, and all of that. I think, it's been Michael Ward who discovered that Lewis almost certainly, intentionally or otherwise, built into this story the ideals of Jove. Jove, Jupiter, the king of the planets, kind of the king of the solar system. Even some of the minerals mentioned in the story and the colors hearken to Jove. And that, by the way, is why Peter and other Narnians are exclaiming, "By Jove." It's not just a thing that people said, but Lewis was wanting to season the story with people invoking joviality. I mean, we still even have that word. It's related to joy. There's a kind of joy that makes you serious, as Lewis says in a later story. It's a kingly and happy victory over the forces of cold and death, which leads me back to Aslan, because in the movies and in the book, it is Aslan, not the Pevensies, who defeat the witch. In fact, I really like it in the Walden film 20 years ago. we could celebrate that as this episode 2. It released in 2005. Wow. I love that Peter has a boss battle with the White Witch and he's losing. And then suddenly Aslan came bounding in. Someone there was paying attention, or at least catching the vibes that Lewis was laying down. And Aslan does have the final victory, and I love the way that he just jumps on the witch and he is in full wild King of Beasts, tear her throat out mode. And then it's appropriate for a PG movie, but it's intense, and it's very much in keeping with the spirit of the book, even though in the book it happens a little bit more off the page. By the way, gotta say, if we're going to talk about the film briefly, gotta say major shout outs to probably the best cast member of the Walden film, Tilda Swinton. I'd not heard of her when the casting was announced. There was a rumor for a while it was going to be a Nicole Kidman for some reason, but Tilda Swinton totally has defined this role for a generation. And she obviously loved it so much, she actually came back to do it in 2 movies when she didn't have to and really didn't belong, but I didn't begrudge her the opportunity to make the cameo, which was forced even in the Dawn Treader movie for some reason. But she's fantastic in the first film. She's sociopathic. She's doing the comforting, soft-spoken voice one moment and then raging maniac the next moment, but always kind of restrained and just a terrific villain. And I think she said in some behind-the-scenes interviews that she was looking forward to be the Margaret Hamilton for a new generation of kids and freaking them out with a white witch instead of a green-faced witch.
Well, I think she's still fantastic in Prince Caspian, and I think it's because of how well she was established in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
I'm okay with her in Prince Caspian, the movie, yeah.
I mean, I just think she's so much more menacing in that because people have forgotten how bad she is. You know, there's the whole scene with Nickabrick and the hag. They're trying to resurrect her, essentially, and I just pulled up some quotes here because that part, it's so memorable to me, where Nickabrick says, "I'll believe in anyone or anything that'll better these cursed Telmarine barbarians to pieces or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything, Aslan or the White Witch."
Oh, we're seeing a little of that these days, by the way.
Yes.
Have you noticed?
Yes. I mean, it's history repeats itself in that people want to either demonize the heroes of history, or they want to resurrect the villains and rehabilitate them. And, quite literally they do that in the film and in the story. It's so chilling to me. And it's even crazier that like Peter is like drawn into this, at least in the movie, of like, wait, you were there, Peter, like you remember this. Like Nickabrick obviously wasn't born at the time of the when the White Witch ruled Narnia, but we have this story of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe to really establish that Jadis is not there to help you. Like she's there to rule over you. And later in that speech, Nickabrick says, "We want power, and we want a power that will be on our side." there's something practical. Wow. Just the whole idol of pragmatism, whatever gets us what we want. And it's the other analogy of like, well, I didn't think the face-eating leopard would eat my face. I just was trying to ride the leopard until it ate everyone else's faces.
The face-eating Malgrim chief of the secret police. Yeah, there's got to be some World War II influence there. I mean, the White Witch literally has a secret police made up of wolves. Lewis didn't fight in World War II. He fought in World War I, the First World War, before the much more intense sequel. But he was keeping up, and definitely some of those motifs got into this story and her villainy in particular.
Yeah. In Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, she's this very obvious villain, right? Like she's made the entire planet an eternal winter. Well, that's no fun. I mean, after doing a few snowmen, it gets kind of old because then you can't grow anything and you're always freezing to death. And so how could you even survive that? But in Prince Caspian, it's like, well, maybe she wasn't all that bad. I mean, that was a long time ago. Maybe she's changed. Maybe she can help us. Maybe the Telmarines are worse. And there's all this moral relativism that comes out, and there's this impatience of waiting on Aslan. And to me, that is it's so relevant. Like it's so clear of like how we get drawn in and really it shows what a powerful character is. She's able to bewitch people hundreds of years later. Like that's how powerful her magic is, that she's able to bring people under her spell and really just fool them into becoming her subjects, because that's all that she wants. All she wants is just to rule over everything and just have ultimate power and just destroy anything that gets in her way. I mean, she is the ultimate narcissist.
Zach, I just realized after a quick look up that Prince Caspian, the book, the second Chronicle of Narnia, was released in October 1951. So I can all but guarantee, listeners, if we're on the ball here, that we'll be doing a sequel to this episode next October in 2026. And that's when maybe we'll need to talk more about Nickabrick and the complex nature of villainy there. So, it's a bit of a counterpoint to the idea that the White Witch is good as a simple villain. She's a sociopathic sorceress who wants to control the world just because. You don't know that she has a past with Aslan. You don't know all the stuff we now know in The Magician's Nephew that fleshes her out a bit, but it's enough to make her a simple fairy tale villainess here. But there's also great points to be said about the complex villainy and the gray areas. And then what happens if you've got a dwarf who suddenly wants to go rehabilitate Hitler and say that Churchill was the villain all along? Where have I heard that before? Anyway, there are strengths to both kinds of villainy. But the greatest strength of the story may be simply the immersion into another world, which we'll talk about in just a second. Quick stop by our third sponsor, myself. I think it'll be me through the end of the year, unless someone comes in and steals it from me. There's that sci-fi novel I've talked about, Above the Circle of Earth, closing in on the 9-month anniversary now, just launched in spring from Enclave Publishing. This is the space missionaries story that's set 100 years from now, in which Brock and Alicia Rivers return with their family from exile on Mars to launch the first missionary space mission and fight the secular regime. I've had this story in the works for quite some time, and it's been an honor to finally launch her thanks to the fine folks from Enclave Publishing. And it is available now in hardcover, digital, and audiobook. You can see that amazing cover in our show notes for episode 289. Or do subscribe free. I will tell you, not the usual pitch, not just because it's me pitching myself, but I will say, folks, you're going to want to subscribe free at estephenburnett.com for any upcoming updates over the next couple of months. Not only am I trying to make signed copies available on my website, but we're going to have updates. I'll be firing that up as soon as I am able to. Subscribe free at estephenburnett.com. Get those links in the show notes for more updates about the space mission. So back from the spaceships to on this side of the wardrobe to the other side of the wardrobe for chapter 3 and the wardrobe. I've already mentioned at the top of the show that when I was a kid, I, to my chagrin, read the Narnia series all wrong. I don't mean I read The Magician's Nephew first, although I may have been tempted, because The Magician's Nephew is a little more sci-fi-ish, actually. It has a more interesting magic system in there. but I was captivated by the portal moments of each of the first 4 books. And to me, that idea was so fascinating that my little hyperfixated brain couldn't seem to get past those into the rest of the story. To me, the idea of jumping from England into another world was just so awesome. I just kind of wanted to think about that for a little while. First, there was the wardrobe, of course, the most famous one. And then there's a little bit more vague transition in the train station in Prince Caspian. And then there's the painting of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. That was probably my second favorite portal. And then there was the door on the moor that Eustace and Jill find in the silver chair. Each one of those transports you into Narnia, and that to me was an absolutely thrilling idea. Stepping through an ordinary object into another world. And of course, I needed to be a good reader and then go all the way in and immerse myself into the other world rather than hyperfixating on the method of entry all the time. There's probably some kind of allegory there if I was to force it. To this day, however, Zach, I think the wardrobe is the most iconic and most magical way into Narnia, if for no other reason than not a lot of us go to train stations these days. And when we do, we're probably not in the mood to go into a fantastic world. We're going to get on a train and go somewhere that maybe we don't want to go, or maybe we do. And that's maybe kind of magical enough. But back in the Lewis's day, it was much more ordinary. Maybe we've thought about jumping into a painting or just stepping through a door, a mysterious door, and then getting into a world. But most kids, I'd say, if we were to find a wardrobe and hide in it, then we are already in peak imagination mode. We're playing hide and seek like the kids do, at least in the movie version. And we are thinking maybe about other worlds that we might find, or we're imagining ourselves as heroes or characters of some form or another. Children then as now can hide in real closets, and we're already using our imagination. So Lewis taps into that, and maybe that's why he kind of now owns the idea of stepping through a door or a closet or a wardrobe and getting into an imaginary world. And if we were blessed to grow up with Narnia, with that early exposure as a child, when we're already absorbing these ideas and we're a little bit more, in a sense, innocent, who hasn't suspected, at least for a moment, that it could be true? If you saw a wardrobe like Lucy would have seen, now, especially if you've read Narnia, aren't you going to double check just to be absolutely sure, just in case? By the way, I think that that's a gift of God to believe in those fantasies, even for micro moments. Like, I caught myself the other day just speculating, and then just for a split second, you think, oh, of course it's true. And it's not, all right. It's not literally true. There's a whole deal with Father Christmas that we'll be talking about. A lot of families will be talking about now, getting into the Christmas season. But some days, I actually think about St. Nicholas, Father Christmas, Santa Claus, and I think, oh, it's all true. Just for a second or two, it feels like it could possibly be real. And then once that fantasy, though, ends, you find what it was about, hopefully, in the real world. You, like the children, tumble out of the wardrobe, but you have that memory of this whole world, this whole alternate reality of magical creatures and Aslan and of great victory and battles and everything. And then in our world, it only lasted a few seconds. I love the time difference between the worlds. It's a little bit of a sci-fi element there. You mostly see that in sci-fi, but it happens in Narnia in a very unique way. But isn't that kind of like when we suspect those fantasies might be real? And now the Pevensies have to go through that with this abrupt and almost tragic ending to the story, where suddenly they're all falling out of the wardrobe. And in the films, and certainly in the book, every time I read it or watch the movie, I'm going, no, don't. You don't have to get the white stag. You don't have to investigate the lamppost. Go back. It's like the reverse of a haunted house. Go, you don't need to go there. Stay in the fantasy forever. But you got to go back to the real world sometime, but bring the change with you. Let that world, as Aslan says in another story, have its purpose to inform us more about the real world, and in particular, find Aslan in the real world. That's probably the other most overt element of the Chronicles of Narnia is Aslan's reminder, his encouragement at the end of Dawn Treader, which almost feels like a trilogy ender, but it's not. Lewis wrote 7 books. over the next 5 years after The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe. They expand the world. They go deeper into the meanings of Narnia. They go in some surprising directions, across the sea, into the wild northern wastes. We go far south into the land of Calormen and the other lands around Narnia. We learn a little bit about Telmar and other places, and then even get a hint about what's deep below and far above this land. And even though it's such a simple series that's so accessible for people, so many people have found such depth there. And it all starts with The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe.
I absolutely love the idea in this story of, this like hidden room or this hidden little portal that only children can find, and it doesn't always work, and it plays by its own rules. So my grandparents growing up, they had a lot of antique furniture, and one of the things they had in abundance when they're in their house was wardrobes. And obviously these were made in a time where there weren't built-in closets, I guess, because that was essentially your closet. Now my mom has 2 of these at her house, one in her bedroom, one in the entry hall. And it's funny because she's every couple of years, my poor mom is like, do you want one of these wardrobes in your house? Because it's just like kind of taking up space she doesn't really have in her house. And I'm like, no, our house is even more crowded. I don't know where we'd fit it.
Well, even the professor put his wardrobe in the spare room, which he was privileged to have, and most of us don't have one of those.
Right. It's just kind of an awkward piece of furniture that doesn't really fit anywhere. So I'm like, no, just keep it at your house. Sorry, Mom. Well, every time my kids go over there, they love to play in those wardrobes. So many times I've come over to pick them up after they spend an afternoon with Grandma, and they've been playing in one of the wardrobes, and it's just so natural for kids to want to go into one of those and to just imagine where it could take you. I think it's the perfect device that Lewis uses for children to go on an adventure to some far off place. It's part of this whole other trend. I see a lot of like, again, I mentioned, my dream thing of like a hidden bookshelf door. And I've seen so many like cool home improvement things where they've made like a little hidden room under a staircase or a hidden room up in the attic. A lot of home improvement things that I would never personally have the skills to do. And I don't have the money to hire anyone. But I love the idea of this, of like just this little hidden room that only children can go into, that only they can kind of squeeze into. And it's just their little space. I mean, it takes me back to being a kid of like, my friend I grew up with lived across the street from me, Matt. I believe it was sister's room. There was a door from her closet into their attic. And it was just an access door to get to, I don't know, the furnace or water heater or something. But it was actually quite a bit of space in that little compartment. And all growing up, Matt was like, yeah, my parents are talking about, building a little extended room in here and maybe just a playroom for us kids. Year after year, we're like, oh, have they made that spare room yet? Like, have they built that little area? Because it's just the funnest thing when you're a kid.
Can we even say spare room anymore? Or are we doomed to forever tumnusify the pronunciation? By the way, you can get away with that when you're a kid. But the last time I tried to play in a wardrobe, I ended up with a restraining order from IKEA. And it wasn't even worth it. There were no magical worlds in the back. And frankly, if there were magical worlds in the back of the wardrobe, I don't think it would be the IKEA ones. Those are so ordinary. And yet, even in The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, I will note, and put the movie version out of your head, even though it's really cool, there's nothing particularly magical about this wardrobe. It's an ordinary piece of furniture. Like, it's big enough to have winter coats hanging in there. I think Lewis even mentions a glass in the door. But it's much more of a shabbier wardrobe, like you would get from like a low budget, BBC TV version. Actually, probably the BBC version of The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe probably was a little closer to what Lewis described. And yet, I do like the film version where the wardrobe itself is like sculpted and magnificent, and it's iconic. And I can close my mind and like it has a silhouette. I mean, not a lot of wardrobes have an iconic silhouette, but that one does. That is a fine wardrobe, and it's got symbols from its origin that you later learn about, carve it into the door so you can tell, ooh, they almost overthought this. But it also makes sense to show that, magical looking things can take you to magical places. But I love the idea of an ordinary object taking you to a magical place. And Zach, I do think that this idea of the ordinary portal is a little bit undervalued now in even Christian-made fantasy. As I see dozens of descriptions of books that we put in the Lorehaven library, like each of which may be a great story, I just note that there are fewer stories about ordinary people going into a magical world through ordinary means. Some of the descriptions start off with character X is a magical creature in this magical world, and there are the limits. We're not going into this magical world to meet the magical creature and to experience the magic secondhand. We are the magical creature. And so it just seems if you're doing that every time, it skips a step. It's almost disenchanting. Suddenly, what's magical and otherworldly itself becomes commonplace and ordinary because we're not entering it from the ordinary world through the means of the regular character in the story. There's nothing particularly interesting about Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, except at first. And then you get to know them a little. Like Lewis puts a lot into their dialogue to let you know about their sibling dynamics. And the film actually does a decent job fleshing that out too. Like it's kind of a magnified version of the book characters. Edmund, of course, is the most interesting because he's the traitor at first. And you get that plot arc there, which is dynamic. But they are otherwise ordinary children. And so for any creators out there, I just want to say, leave space for that. I don't think anyone will say, oh, you're just ripping off Narnia, because right now everybody is, by that same standard, ripping off the self-contained magical world story where everyone has superpowers or everyone has some sort of magical gift. And so if the magical is ordinary, it's not magical anymore. I almost want to quote Syndrome again. And I'd love to see more of those types of portal stories. Portals are great, and they're almost kind of biblical because they keep us humble, and then we get to experience this new world through the eyes of a child.
Well, and I think what makes Narnia work so well is that it really is this bigger world with a lot more going on, and it doesn't all revolve around the protagonist. Like, it's not just about finding your true self, identity, meaning, or whatever. Like it's way beyond just like self-image kind of stuff. It's like Aslan is inviting them into this bigger story where he's the central character. It's not them. It's not like, oh, find your destiny, and I think that's sort of the counterfeit we've been given through a lot of modern fantasy, where it's all about the self and how a story or a quest or whatever fulfills the self. But it's like, no, what makes Narnia so good is what makes the real story of the Bible so amazing, which is that it's God's story and that we're invited to be a part of it, and not just a spectator. We're invited to be a participant, but we're not the hero of the story either. And we get to do heroic things, and he literally makes them kings and queens over Narnia, but he's still the ruler of the whole land. And I think without that, fantasy just becomes very small.
Amen. Zach, the whole idea of the great Christian-made fantasy is not, here's a book that will help you find yourself. Like, for one thing, if I was handed a book that way, my defenses would be up. It'd be like being handed a book and saying, here, this will help you learn not to cheat on tests. Like, okay, now it's a chore. Thanks. So you just sapped all the joviality out of it. But if you're handed a book saying, hey, here's an amazing story about a magical land and 4 ordinary children that discover their place in it, okay, now I'm not only set up better for the type of story this actually is, but I am actually now better prepared to discover who I am because I'm not looking for myself in the story. I am losing myself in the story. I love that idea of losing oneself, because not only does it work on multiple levels, but that is biblical. I mean, Jesus says to take up your cross. He says, he who would lose his life is ultimately going to find it. But if you hang on to it, you're going to lose it. Jesus is not so foolish as to say, you ought not be concerned about yourself. Like, that doesn't count. He says, no, like, I understand this is a legitimate self-interest. So in order to find yourself, you need to lose yourself. And fantastical stories like Narnia help us do that. They're not about the Pevensies being empowered, unlike some of, unfortunately, the themes that were forced into the later movies of the original trilogy. They're not about identity or even morals or allegories. They're about something that's so much more important, and all those things thrown in: losing yourself, humbling yourself, seeing the world through the eyes of a child, through this illustration of a magical world that is ruled over by a benevolent, not tame, but good lion.
Well, to you, our listener, we want to know, how did you first read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Was it read to you by a parent or another relative or a teacher? Was it something you just happened to discover in the library? Was it an assignment from your school? Was it something your pastor talked about or read? Or you even had a book club, perhaps in one of your communities? Or if you are a longtime listener to the podcast, you may remember Nadine Brandis from about a year and a half ago shared how she broke into this locked basement door. She picked the lock as a kid and found The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe in this hidden
that's
vault.
my favorite. I think I've forgotten about that one. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
so it's like
just petty larceny. That's all.
It's like a double wardrobe adventure that Nadine went on. So if you have an epic story like that, if you have a simple story, in bonus points, if you can remember where you were, how old you were and where you were when you read this, we'd love to hear those stories. So send that to podcast@lorehaven.com, or you can comment anywhere you see this episode on our website, Facebook, Instagram, X, or Discord.
Zach, I just remembered that Christmas that I got the set, my family was living in a old house, probably the oldest house I've ever lived in Ashland, Kentucky. And it felt very much like the professor's mansion. It was the kind of house that still had like a servant staircase in the back. I am not making this up. So it kind of felt like the professor's mansion, and you just unlocked that for me. That house felt a little bit magical. And wow, that third floor of the house, it was like this giant attic space with no air conditioning. None of the house had air conditioning. Just made all of that feel magical. And so it was probably appropriate that I discovered Narnia there. Next on Fantastical Truth, long ago, before the great Lion Aslan bounded onto bookshelves, C.S. Lewis wrote a science fiction novel set on mythological Mars. From there, his hero, Dr. Elwyn Ransom, was carried by angels in the sequel to the sister planet Venus. And from there, the Ransom/Cosmic/Space trilogy descended to the dull world of college board meetings, inner ring politics, and a secret technocratic society bent on world domination, with the aid of mad science and demons and everything. That was book 3, and 80 years after That Hideous Strength was published, we explore why C.S. Lewis created this earthbound and weird and wonderful pre-political supernatural thriller. By the way, that will be the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, Tuesday, December the 2nd. There will be no episode on Tuesday, November 25th for the Thanksgiving holiday. And so we hope that you will spend that season with your loved ones, learning to give thanks to our creator, the author of our story, for all the wonderful magic that he has put into the real world. And I pray that we can see this real world through enchanted eyes and show that kind of gratitude and thanks to our Lord and Savior, our great Lion, Jesus Christ, as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.